All right, so this is Andrew, and I'm going to show you and go over some of the dissimilar hardware and bare metal restore with both Windows and kind of give a brief overview of how it works on the Mac as well. All right, so first I'm going to go ahead and cover how it works on the Mac, since the Mac is pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, we do not have any sort of boot disk for the Mac, because Apple hasn't really provided any sort of boot disk or any way for anyone to boot off of something to do a sort of bare metal recovery, but we have a pretty good strategy in place for that sort of DR scenario with the Macs. What we recommend is we actually recommend making a copy of at least one boot drive for your Mac, make a copy to an external hard drive, and then you can use that external hard drive to boot whatever Mac happens to go down and start doing a disaster recovery restore from that external hard drive. So for example, just to kind of give you an overview of how that script would look, you would set up a script where you would select your boot drive as a source, and then your destination would be, say, an external hard drive. And you would want to set the destination type to overwrite entire volume, so that way it's going to copy over everything and it's going to make that external hard drive bootable.
We did have a comment here, Andrew, too, that it says that you can use a USB stick 32 gigabytes to install Mac OS X to it. So
right, you could do that as well, and so you could do it either way. So you could use the USB stick and you know, install the OS to an external hard drive and then install Retrospect on it. If you do happen to go with the copy script, one important note for the external hard drive is there's an option you need to make sure is deselected, otherwise the disk won't be bootable. And it's this ignore ownership on this volume. This needs to be unchecked, or otherwise you won't be able to boot off of the disk. But once you boot off of the external hard drive, you can bring up Retrospect. You can either bring up a client or you can bring it up locally, and then you can go through your restore that way. And also to kind of talk about dissimilar hardware with the Mac, we don't really have a dissimilar hardware agent, and that's because Mac hardware is pretty similar. So as long as the hardware can support the OS that you're restoring, then you should be able to restore to a different Mac. So that's pretty straightforward for how the Mac's going to work. If you need to do a live restore, however, we generally don't recommend live restores too often, just because you can boot from an external hard drive and then you can do a restore to an erase disk. So you're laying all the file, you're not overwriting anything, and it's a much cleaner restore process. But if you have to do a live restore, you want to make sure that the OS that you're restoring, so that you want to install the same OS that you're restoring. So if you're restoring, say, 10.8.5, you want to install 10.8.5 and then go through the live restore.
And again, can you kind of explain what a live restore is there? I mean, just in general.
Live restore is you're just installing an OS. So if your system goes down, you replace your hard drive. A live restore is where you install the OS first before going through the restore. So you would install the OS onto your new hard drive, install either Retrospect or the client, and then you would restore on top of the running operating system.
Thank
you. That's what we consider a live restore. So from the Mac standpoint, that's all there is to it for the full system or dissimilar hardware restore. Now for Windows, we actually have an actual different process. So for Windows, we're actually leveraging WinPE, which is provided by Microsoft, which allows us to have this sort of pre-boot environment where we can either run Retrospect or the Retrospect client and do a bare metal restore or even a dissimilar hardware restore. So for just for the bare metal restore, there's no license required. That comes with all editions of Retrospect, and it's accessed under Backup Disaster Recovery. So when you first click on this disaster recovery menu, I already have, it requires the Windows Automated Installer Kit, and if you don't have it installed, we'll actually have a link here where you can click on it and it will download the Windows Automated Installation Kit for you. And then after installing it, you can go through this Prepare for Disaster Recovery wizard. So going through the wizard's really straightforward. All you do is click Next. It's going to ask you where do you want to save this ISO file we're going to create. And then you click on Next, and it creates it for you. So we go through and we create this for you. And after it's done getting created, you can burn this ISO file to a CD, and then this is what you would boot off of when you'd have to go through a disaster recovery restore. Now, since we do have a dissimilar hardware add-on, I'll go ahead and show that.
Now, with that DR, with the DR agent, Andrew, is that good for both the client and the host machine?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So this will you only need to create this one file, so you don't need to recreate this at any time. You just need one disk, and it will have both the Retrospect application and the client on it. I guess the only time that you may need to recreate this is if you did not have Dissimilar Hardware licensed, and then you bought Dissimilar Hardware. You need to recreate this ISO file as, without the license, you don't get the Dissimilar Hardware Restore option when you boot off of the disk.
Excellent, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So to go back to the Dissimilar Hardware Restore add-on, you'll see that we have an actual entry for it here. So if you do not have this entry for Dissimilar Hardware Restore, when you're creating this ISO file, there will not be an option to perform a Dissimilar Hardware Restore. But after you license it and then you create this, and you go to create the ISO file, it will include it automatically. So you don't need to do anything else other than just license it. And then while that's still creating, I can show you on a different VM what the actual disaster recovery and dissimilar hardware screens look like. So if this was a different machine that just went down, this is what it would look like going through the DR restore. Yeah, okay.
And while some of you, this is going on, just so you guys know too, we have different versions. I probably should have put that on the deck. I'll make sure I get it out to you of the Dissimilar Hardware Agent. So, if they're running just a smaller disk-to-disk or professional license in a small network, we do have a specific version that you can build just for that and the attached clients. We have another one for our larger, the single server, small biz server, multi-server versions. So just, we have a couple of flavors of the Dissimilar hardware to allow you guys to implement it in smaller situations, networks. And they say it does cover the host plus any connected clients.
So then here it's booted off that disk. So have to accept the terms and then the end user license agreement. And then here we come up to a menu that gives you several options for going through the DR restore. So the first option is to set up my hard drive before restoring. So if you have a new disk, you'll need to go through this and you need to recreate your partition, or if you want to format and delete your partition ahead of time, you can do that as well. So I've already have a partition here. It's unlabeled, and it will have to be set as active for the restore to work properly. So once your partition is set up, we also do have this load drivers for network or storage adapters. So if you have a hard drive controller that requires drivers before Windows can even see the disk, this is what you would use to load those drivers. So you could put those drivers on, say, a USB drive or USB stick, and then when you click on this, you just need to browse to the INF file. It will bring up a window. You could browse to it, and then just choose the INF file for the driver that you're trying to load. To kind of further expand on that, so since the version of WinPE that we're using is WinPE 3.0, so it's based off of Windows 7, and this is a 32-bit version. So anytime you're loading drivers in this environment, you need to load a Windows 7 32-bit driver for this to work. So if you have a storage controller that requires a driver, you need to find the Windows 7 32-bit version. If for some reason the storage controller does not have a 32-bit driver but a 64-bit driver only, we do have instructions on our knowledge base on how to create a 64-bit DR disk. You actually would have to use when you install the Windows Automated Installer Kit, there is a command line prompt where you can go through and create your own ISO file. And we've given instructions on our knowledge base on how to do that. In the future, though, we will be including an option where when you go through to prepare for disaster recovery, you can select 32 versus 64-bit. So that way you don't have to create one manually. But for now, anything that you load, any driver that you load has to be for Windows 7 or Windows 2008 R2 32-bit. And so this will allow you, like I said, to either access your hard drive, or if you need to, or say if your backup is on a network share, and the WinPE environment doesn't have a driver for your NIC card, you can load the driver here. And then map network drive, this is where, like I was saying, if you need to access your backup set that's on a NAS or a network share, you can type in the UNC path, assign it a drive letter, and then enter in the username and password for that share. And then here is where we actually get to where we can actually launch the product. So restore locally, this is if you had your backup set directly attached, you could click on restore locally. This will launch the Retrospect application, and from here, this is where you can go through the full system restore. And one other thing to mention, since we're using this WinPE environment, Microsoft has an API that allows us to recreate the partition schemes in Windows 2008 and later, which is called the ASR writer. So this allows us to recreate the partitions of the original disk that was backed up. One thing that's important to know about this, though, is if say your hard drive fails and you replace it, you need to restore to a drive that is the same size or larger than the original disk. If it's smaller, then the ASR writer is not going to be able to recreate the partitions, even if the partition is smaller than the actual drive itself, the drive size itself.
And again, everyone, just so you know, there's a lot of info going here. Obviously, Andrew's done it a few times. If you have any additional questions, feel free to ask as we go along. Make a note of it. Feel free to email it over and say, hey, Warner, can you, send me the link on the knowledge base on how to take care of that. Whatever you guys need, just make sure you note it, put it down, let me know now, and I'll make sure that it gets to you.
And so here, what I'm showing here is if I had like an external hard drive with my backups, I was able to connect it. So here you would, when you go to restore, it it doesn't see your catalogs or any of your backups. This is where you would, go to open your catalog file for your backup sets, so that way you could go through the restore. So after I open it, then here you would choose the C drive. It's going to go through its matching, and then destination, you can choose that C drive. Now, one thing that's important, though, to notice is that since this is it's booted off of this CD, is that you may not get the right drive letters. So if you have multiple disks, that doesn't necessarily mean that drive C is going to be the disk that you want to restore to. So you want to really pay attention to what drive letters are getting assigned to what drive. Since I only had one disk in this VM, it got assigned C, so it's not a big deal. But what may be a good idea is if what your backups are stored on is directly connected to the machine, if you can, disconnect it first, and then set up your drive for restore. And then once you're ready to go through the restore process, then connect your backups to it. So that way you're not accidentally erasing your backup drive or formatting your backup drive. And then here it'll scan. There's already some information on that C drive, so that's why it's going through the scan. But with an empty drive, it wouldn't go through the scan because there'd be no files there.
So the scan's just basically going through and looking what's on that drive now.
Yeah, during a restore, we'll scan the drive that we're restoring to, and we'll actually do some matching. So if there's some files on the drive that exist in the backup, we won't restore that file again. So that way it will decrease the actual time it takes for the restore.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, in typical.
I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, yeah, just in typical DR scenarios, though, there's usually not going to be anything, because if you're replacing your disk or you're going to a completely new machine, chances are it's empty, and there's not going to be any files on the disk you're restoring to.
And what operating systems does Dissimilar Hardware work with?
So currently, Dissimilar Hardware Restore works with XP 2003 and later. So that includes 2008, 2008 R2, Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, and Server 2012. Currently, it does not support 2012 R2 or 8.1, but we are going to be including support for that in a future update, though. So we're already working on that.
Okay.
And so here it gives you, how much it's going to restore. Since it's actually, there's files there, it's telling you how many files are going to be overwritten and how much free space is on the destination.
I just had a question. Does it? Oh, sorry. I had a question that does it to support Mac, and it would not, correct?
No, with Mac, like I was saying earlier, with Mac, the hardware is, Apple doesn't really deviate from their hardware profile too much. So as long as the hardware supports the OS that you're restoring, you can restore to different hardware. So if you have say 2 MacBook Pros and they both support 10.7, if you can take the backup of one MacBook Pro and restore it to the other one, and it should start up just fine. So
let's see. And then in the follow-up of what do you recommend for DR for a Mac then? It's best procedure. I think you might have just answered that. So basically, create a full bootable copy, or do just from a backup. What's the best DR solution for a Mac then, in your opinion?
Well, the best DR solution would be to have some sort of either an external hard drive or a USB stick that has the OS already installed on it. So if you need to replace the disk, or you're going to a new machine, you boot off of this external hard drive, and then that way, when you do the restore, you restore to an empty disk. So if that means you have to erase the disk ahead of time, or I guess most importantly, you're not you're not restoring on top of a running OS would be best practice. So whether that's restoring to an empty drive, or it happens to be your boot disk, but you're not booted off of that disk, that would be ideal. So that way that you're not restoring on top of anything, there's nothing running, and it makes for a much more cleaner restore.
And then another question. So often we had problems. We do not overwrite all the files. Can you please tell us a little bit more about the differences again?
About differences between overwriting the entire disk, or?
Let's see. Can we get a little additional information on that? Let's see. Oh, it says, so we often have problems when we do not overwrite all the files. So
right, which is why we recommend in most cases to restore to an empty blank disk, because you're not for one, Retrospect's not matching, and if for some reason, for example, if the OS that was on the disk was, say, 10.7, but you're restoring a 10.8 backup, if for some reason some files happen to match, there's probably going to be problems, because the file that's not getting overwritten was really intended for 10.7 and not 10.8. So by restoring to an empty disk, we're going to restore all the files that are in the backup. There's not going to be any chance of any other files that might not be overwritten because they match. So,
and if you're restoring a Mac, but you don't have an external HD with functioning operating system, what's the best way to proceed?
At that point, then you would do a live restore, where if you had a failure, you would install the OS that you're going to restore. So if you have a backup of, like I was saying, like say 10.8.5, you would install 10.8.5, install Retrospect or the Retrospect client, and then restore on top of the running operating system. So it has to be the same OS that you backed up.
No, I know, Andrew, I did once where I needed a larger drive for my Mac, so I created a full bootable copy to a new drive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that recommended from a disaster recovery? Like if you created a full bootable copy and onto an external one, put it in an external casing and then put it off to the side so you can, swap out the drives if needed at a later point. I mean, is that a viable solution?
Yep, that works. And again, and if you have multiple drives in your Mac or multiple partitions, and you don't have an external drive, you can install the OS to one partition and then restore to the other. And, that would be preferable than doing a live restore as well.
Okay. I think that's it for questions for now. Sorry. Go on, Andrew.
Okay, no, that's all right. So coming back to the Windows restore, I'm not going to go through this restore because it's going to take a while, but as you can see here, it says it's going to restore the Windows system state, the Windows security information. So after this is done with the restore, then if it wasn't a dissimilar hardware restore, you would just restart the OS or the machine, and it would come back up as it was at the time of backup. Now, if this was a dissimilar hardware restore, we actually have this adjust drivers to support new hardware. So when you click on this, this will bring up a separate application. It'll go through, it'll look at the disk on your machine, and if you don't have an OS, it'll come up with a message saying it can't find an OS. But here it says this will help you make, it lists Windows 2000, but it's really going to be XP or later. So here it can tell what operating system I have. So it's listing Windows Server 2008 R2 64-bit. It gives you some of the disk information. Click next, and then there's really two options. You can have it adjust the OS to new hardware automatically. So this just goes through a wizard and automatically applies the changes that it thinks it needs to make the OS bootable. So go through, take a look, and then you can apply the changes if you want, or if you're not sure about it, you can say, no, let me reconsider. But if you say yes, apply the changes physically, you can click next. It'll go through, and then that's it. It's done. But the other option, once we get to it, the other option will allow you to specifically point to drivers that you know Windows doesn't have for your hardware. Like if you have a disk controller that you know Windows doesn't have a driver for, you can point to that disk controller driver. But this is where you would point to the driver for the OS that you're restoring. So even though this is Windows 7 2008 R2, if you were restoring a Windows 2012 backup, you would point to a Windows 2012 driver in this case. So when you just click on the plus here, then it would bring up, folder view. Then you can go through and choose the folder that includes your drivers. And then this inject all necessary drivers. So that's going to inject all of the drivers that it finds in that repository. You may not necessarily need to do this. One should be enough if you're just doing your disk controller, or say like a NIC card or video card drivers. And if for some reason there's multiple versions, you can tell it just to keep the latest. And then clicking on next, it'll go through and pretty much do the same thing as the automatic, except it will include those drivers. So here, for example, it could tell that I have this NIC card, but this was part of the Windows installation already, so this will include it. The next, well, I already ran it, so I'm not gonna apply the changes physically. But then it'll run through, do the same thing, and once it's done, that's when you can restart the machine and it will come back up. One thing I didn't cover was the restore as a client. So restore as a client is really straightforward. If it's a client machine, you just click on restore client. It gives you the IP address, and then you can go to a different machine and you can add that client. And it's just giving it some random client name, and then it will ask you to set the password. And then after it gets added, then you can go through a full restore and push it to that client. And then the Dissimilar Hardware would work the same way. After the restore is done, you bring up the Dissimilar Hardware Restore wizard, go through that process, and once done, reboot the machine. So here, that's just showing you all the disks that are on that machine. And one other thing is, since this is a WinPE environment, there are some commands that you can run if needed. It's not generally needed all that often, but we included it just in case. Like for one example, say you're not running a DHCP server for some reason, because the DR disk will try and connect to a DHCP server to get your IP address for the client. But if you don't have one, you can hold down Shift and click on Restore Locally, and this will bring up a command prompt. And from here, you can set a static IP address. And then that way, the client will have a static IP address, and you can restore to it. Or you can do other things through this window. You can run like diskpart if you want to use diskpart, a couple other Windows commands, but for the most part, it's not needed. That's pretty much it. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I missed.
Let's see. So
pretty straightforward. I mean, if there's any other questions, though, I'd be happy to answer any questions, though.
Were there any additional questions out there? And again, so from like now, and just to be clear, so if you had backed up a Windows 7 box,
Hmm.
you had the Dissimilar Hardware Agent, you bought a brand new Windows 8 box, and you could take this, and when you restore back, when you do a full system restore to that new Windows 8 machine, it's going to return as your old Windows 7 machine. I mean, it's just going to look identical to it, right? The Windows 8 will be gone.
Yeah, yeah, effectively, yeah. If you buy a new machine that comes with Windows 8 and you do this dissimilar hardware restore, it'll be running Windows 7 after the restore is done.
Okay. Here's a question. Do you have any idea to rebuild, or if you have, restore servers like HP ProLiant servers Gen 8? HP has implemented a repository drivers for RAID and network into separate RON on the machine,
Hmm.
and you could not integrate the drivers while you install the OS.
So this is where the load drivers or network adapters would come into play. So you should be able to browse to where that repository is. Did you say where do you say the repository was?
It said drivers for RAID and network on separate ROM. Let's see. So, um, yeah, restore
So on the
servers like HP has implemented the repository drivers for RAID and network into a separate RON on the machine. That's all it says. RON
so
RON.
so he's saying that they're not accessible when Windows is being installed.
Let's see. Restore is implemented into this. So just yeah, it's in basically it's in a separate location and stuff, and you cannot integrate the drivers while you install the OS.
Because if that location isn't available, you know, during the install of Windows, I mean, we're not going to be able to access it either unless it's somehow given like a drive letter or
It,
it's accessible
it's in the
um,
ROM in the ROM. So
in the ROM itself. Yeah.
yeah.
To be honest, I'm not sure that's something we can try and investigate. I mean, we haven't tested a machine that has that sort of setup, but if you're able to download those drivers from HP's website, then that would be the solution. Then would be to download those drivers and put it on a USB stick and load those drivers for the NIC and the hard drive controller.
So when you're loading them, just go there, map, go to that and pull them from there.
Right.
Is there Linux backup capability?
There's Linux backup capability, but we don't have any sort of dissimilar hardware or DR disk for Linux at the moment. I'm not sure if that's on the roadmap or not.
Sorry, and the question all was it's not. You're saying it's not possible to download it from the HP site, or
Uh,
sorry, I got a follow up question saying.
Oh, sure. What was the follow-up question?
Basically said it's not accessible. It's not. It's not possible. I'm not sure if it's not possible to download from the HP site or.
So is it that the drivers are not available from HP to download,
That,
or
that's what it's
just
possibly
not?
looking. You might have been responding to something else, but yeah, it may be not accessible. Okay, so he's saying maybe we could talk later about this. So yeah, and so yeah, what we'll do is I'll make sure you guys connect up. I'll get your information, and so that way you guys can go through this with more specifics and stuff to make sure whatever the issues are that we work on resolving it here, or maybe
Yeah,
there's
I mean,
already a resolution.
if it's something like that, where if for some reason the drivers aren't available to download, I mean, that's something we'd have to investigate and look into to see if that's something that we would work with.
So, so the best way to restore a Linux box then would be the same procedure as described for the Mac, or what would be the correct? What would be the best disaster recovery procedures for Linux boxes? I guess is really the question then.
It would be a live restore, because I don't think that you'd be able to restore to an empty drive. I don't think we've tested that with the Linux DR yet. Typically, right now, what we recommend would be the live restore. So you would install the same version of Linux that you had backed up, and then restore on top of the running operating system.
Okay. And I know that there are more Linux enhancements, just so you know, coming down the road. Let's see. No additional questions yet. We'll give everybody another chance to ask a few. So we went over Dissimilar Hardware. The licensing is, again, I'll make sure that you guys have the actual licensing information with Dissimilar Hardware. As he mentioned, the DR agent itself is built into our base Windows version to be able to create that disaster recovery CD. The Dissimilar Hardware agent is just an add-on agent that allows you to create that additional level that gives you that Dissimilar Hardware Restore ability. Let's see. We got one additional question, a little off top, but that's okay. And again, if you guys got any other questions about disaster recovery, just general, I mean, Andrew's the guy, so make sure you just fire him off here. You got him on the line. And so definitely, even if it's a little off topic, we'll make sure you get this answered real quick. So when adding a non-local server on the Mac console, the host name is resolved to an IP address before being saved to the preferences. This prevents resolving the name to a different IP address, one on a different external, e.g. external network from one first connecting to the server. Is there a solution to monitor and control the multiple non-retrospect installations on different networks from Mac console?
So that's funny. I believe this person opened a ticket, and I saw that ticket this morning, and I'm asking one of our engineers about that, about what's the expected behavior for the console. So I haven't heard back from him yet. But once I do, I will respond to that ticket, or we can get his contact information and respond to him directly. Either way, but I am confirming with an engineer what's supposed to be the intended behavior for that. And if that is the behavior, is it something that can be changed?
Sounds good. So again, I'll make sure that the correct questions get over him. If you weren't the one that actually sent in the ticket, although probably, but again, if you weren't, I'll make sure that gets over to him. Oh, they did actually send in the
ticket. Okay.
Ticket. So you have the right person.
Yeah.
And see, for any DR prep on, okay, sorry, I'm reading it to myself. That probably doesn't help. Okay. For any DR prep on an OS other than Windows, what is the recommended best protocols so that it is efficient to do a live restore? So for DR prep on something other than Windows, what's the recommended best protocol? So I know you say on Mac, the best thing to do is on a clean drive. And for a live restore like Linux or whatever else, what's the best protocol? You just basically get the machine up with a blank OS, or what's the best strategy?
So you want the same OS, like the same patch, if there's a specific patch level that it was at. So like if it was I guess for Linux, if you're running a specific edition of Linux, I guess we could just say like Red Hat 6, for example. You want to install the same version of Red Hat 6 that you had at the time of backup. Same with the Mac. If you're running a specific patch of 10.8, you want that same patch installed before you do a live restore. So does that answer the question?
It looks like it. Okay. Let's see. Great, and a yes. So those sound like two positive ones. Any other questions? Let's see. Oh, here's one question. Do you need open file backup? Do you need an open file backup to make the image of the running machine?
We recommend using open file backup, especially if you're having any sort of databases running. I mean, yeah, we recommend it. I mean, it's not mandatory because we can back up the system state of the machine through Microsoft provided API calls. So, but in general, it's a good idea to have.
And I mean, that would be more general just in regards to doing the entire backup, Andrew, as opposed not just necessarily creating that DR image. I mean, that doesn't matter as much. It's more of a just as when we're doing the initial full backup of the system, correct?
Yeah.
That's where the open file would come in, not the creating of the image itself.
No.
Okay. And you're welcome. You're welcome. Those are for you. I'm saying you're welcome for you, Andrew, just so you know.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, and Andrew, thank you so much for doing this. I said, really, again, we're really just trying to do whatever we can to make sure that, again, we're getting you guys the right information needed to help you guys implement the correct solutions for your clients. So again, I will expect an email from me. I'll get it out to you as soon as possible today here. Um, if so, you got anything else you need from there, we'll move from that way forward. As I said, I always have access to Andrew. You guys do too, as needed. Yeah, thank you guys for all attending, and I look forward to working with you guys moving forward.